In order to receive your certificate for this Invalsi video training course, there will be a short test at the end of the 4th seminar. For more information, go to the Invalsi Open website. Hello and welcome to this Invalsi video seminar. My name is Oliver Page and I'm here to offer a series of seminars aimed at primary school teachers across all 5 grades. The title of these seminars is The Living Classroom, and the overall topic is how to build a more effective English language learning classroom environment where students develop both language knowledge and active competence. I'll be presenting methodological concepts that link directly to classroom practice. In each seminar, I will take an area of classroom practice such as vocabulary presentation or storytelling, role play or pronunciation, and discuss how to integrate them into a comprehensive approach to teaching that activates students and makes the classroom a dynamic learning environment of real communication. So, what is a living classroom? Well, it's a place where a second language is a living part of everyday life in that classroom, and where students find more than just the teaching of isolated forms and words. In fact, they find the language as a whole. A classroom is an empty space. And it's limited in its size and fixed in the number of people it contains. And as the year passes by, it's really easy to fall into a routine and allow lessons to become predictable and repetitive. It's also easy to allow the course book to do the work. But in a certain way, that means that the teacher is no longer making choices, but just relying on a book. A textbook can only be a part of a student's experience of learning a second language. A living classroom is a place where students and teachers work together and use language, not just learn it. It's that classic distinction between know about and know how. I strongly believe that as teachers, our role in the learning process of a second language is not just to explain language, but to develop competence and skills in our learners. And this is a real challenge in a classroom which, as we know, has certain limits in terms of space, the time we have in it, the materials available, and the technical support on hand. But it's essential that we make the classroom a living space in order to make language meaningful and memorable. So in every moment in our classroom, we're not only teaching English, but using it in every moment. It's a living language of communication, English, not just a school subject in a book. And if we consider it a living language, that way our classroom will offer students many experiences that will connect their emotions, energy, curiosity, enjoyment and growth as an individual to that language. And our classroom will become a living space where children can play, express themselves and develop an important life skill, a second language, and above all, English. Therefore, the living classroom is something more than the syllabus. It comes from how the teacher plans and organizes the class. As a teacher, we have choices. For every lesson, for every single activity, we have choices. And we need to consider many factors that will influence how the learner experiences any activity that we present. So, I'd like to give a couple of examples of choices we may have. I'd like us to consider how we set up the classroom as an example of the choices that we have. Here we've got a setup which is obviously not easy to create in a primary school classroom, but could be created in a space in the school where there are no desks and only chairs. And that's a circle of children around the teacher. This in contrast with obviously what is our classic setup, which is the teacher at the front, maybe standing or sitting behind a desk, students behind desks in pairs usually, everybody looking forward towards the teacher. So I'd just like us to consider what activities would be more effective in the two situations. I mean, looking at the situation of a classroom with all the children looking towards the teacher, certainly this is a more, the attention is drawn towards the teacher of each individual, but there are very few solutions for working as a group and only really one possible pair. This will probably be appropriate for language presentation or focus or individual worksheets or written tests. Whereas if we look at the circle with the teacher at the center, this immediately brings to mind a flexibility of students' movement from one position to another. The teacher themselves is at the center of the group and not at the front, therefore has eye contact with everybody and is quite close to them. All students are looking at each other, and there's an atmosphere of playfulness about it. So what differences would it make? Of course it would make enormous differences. If I'm sitting in a circle with my friends around me and my teacher in the center, I'm free physically to stand up in the space, to turn to the person next to me, to move around the circle like a cog. So it opens up to a whole range of practice activities that would be very difficult to set up in the cluttered classroom. How would the student experience the activity differently? Well, certainly each student would experience, apart from the routine sense of being in your classroom as in any other moment of the day on the right, this situation would certainly be that the student would experience it much more in an isolated way. I'm alone in a classroom, I'm next to a friend, my friends are around me but I can't see them. The teacher is a long way away or the teacher is right in front of me, and I'm probably being asked to concentrate, listen, and maybe put up my hand to say something. On the left, we have the situation of the group in a circle. How do I feel? I feel much more engaged, involved, and ready to do things which may be interesting, innovative, surprising. So another example of making choices is choosing classroom materials or how to represent language. For example, what about this? A clear, colourful, projected series of images that present a lexical set. In this case, it would be clothes. It could also be a flashcard pack. But in any case, language is represented by image. On the right, we've got a girl who is working quietly at her desk, filling out a worksheet. So when would each be most effective and suitable? Well, certainly on the left you've got projected images that draw the attention of a group. So this would be perfect for a group presentation of vocabulary so that you can drill pronunciation and elicit different students to give you words. It would also be suitable for games and practice that go beyond this. Whereas, obviously, the girl on her own is a useful moment for individual consolidation and giving people a chance to work at their own pace. And it's also a moment to check that all students have gathered meaning. Which engages more and captures the imagination? Clearly, the projected image or flashcards, it's colour, it's picture, and therefore a student is dealing with something which is not linguistic, but to do with image, and that is clearly much more stimulating for their imagination and memory, which leads to other activities to consolidate the presentation. Again, that series of pictures, either as flashcards or on the electronic whiteboard. We now have a code for understanding those words. Now we can play with them and use them in order to generate more language and speak English. On the right, we have an activity which is should we say, useful, absolutely, but in a consolidation phase or a controlled practice phase, and models the written version of language, not the spoken. and which involves students individually and which is a group. Clearly on the right we've got an individual task which is necessary, and very many students need that time in order to, shall we say, absorb language. On the left you could lead to all sorts of group activities and obviously presenting to a group. Finally, how would each student experience each activity? Well, I think what we can say is on the left, the experience will be one of being part of a group of people, part of a classroom which is alive and colourful and exciting. Whereas on the right, you would probably be much more in a mode of concentration, individual work, which absolutely is necessary as what we might call a cooler after the class has done something more energetic and enjoyable. If we take this approach to everything we do in the classroom, making our own choices and setting our own objectives as teachers, it will create a very different climate in class, and it will energize our relationship with our students. The kind of classroom I would like to promote is based on Krashen's input hypothesis, which I will talk about a little later, and also about my own experiences as a learner. For many years, on the door to my classroom, I had a notice that read this: "There's no such thing as teaching. There's only learning." I've always believed this to be true, and that learning should be at the centre of teaching practice. This may sound banal, but very often when we as teachers limit ourselves to textbook teaching, without concerning ourselves with how better to vehicle what we want our students to learn. So in preparing lessons and activities, it's essential to consider how the lesson and its activities will engage the class, how it will raise their curiosity, their interest, touch their emotions, excite them. To teach, you need to reach. To reach students, you need to grab and hold their attention. And you need to involve students actively in their learning. To achieve this, I'd like to consider 4 words to keep in mind across all of these seminars and to apply to a month's work or even to a single lesson. So, variety. We can bring variety into all sorts of areas of teaching, and it will make our lessons much more stimulating and interesting for the students. For example, language. Your lessons can involve both familiar language, which students have already studied, and new language, which they need to learn, new words, new structures. That way we can guarantee both that students use language that they're familiar with in every class, but they also have a sense of progress and are stimulated by the introduction of new structures or new words. Materials, obviously, we can use different materials according to the task that we're doing, and certainly a variety of materials make learning more stimulating and more memorable. Flashcards could be used, or on-screen images. Worksheets, if nicely presented, could be used for individual work. The course book itself obviously offers a lot of materials, but if we only use the course book, it becomes predictable and unmemorable, and therefore less stimulating for the students. We might be using something like a role card, which gives the student a particular role to perform something as simple as a shopping role play, or a role play of meeting somebody. And finally, realia. Realia, by this I mean real objects, which obviously can be used in the presentation of language, but not only. They can be really stimulating as a point of focus, or used tactilely by the teacher for role plays or situations. The task we give students, obviously a lesson could involve both written and oral. It could involve individual work, pair work, group work. Further practice or controlled practice of new language could be presented in the form of a game or a quiz or a puzzle or an info gap. All of these will make the student feel more stimulated and interested in each task. We looked at the classroom layout before with that circle of chairs or the teacher at the front. This will give students a real sense that the class is moving, and it will also break up tasks and activities, so they know when a task and an activity is starting and they know when it finishes. It could involve them standing in the space, moving in the space, sitting. They could have no chairs. They might be in a circle of chairs or facing the front, as we looked at before. A variety of student role. What the student is doing in the classroom could be either active or passive, in the sense that they're actively speaking, or they might be passively listening or taking notes or listening to the teacher presenting new language. But certainly we need to give a variety and balance of that, otherwise it will become too passive, and the student will be less involved in the lesson and in learning. And finally, the teacher role. The teacher role varies because the classroom varies in its objectives, its tasks and its activities. So the teacher may be a language presenter, an activity leader, a quiz master, might be a storyteller, a facilitator, a person who is helping people as they do tasks, or a helper for students in difficulty when doing tasks. A monitor, a person who goes around the class and listens while other people are doing activities. Or a learning checker who, after presentation, can check that all students are on board and understand the language presented. The second word is surprise. What are our clearest memories of our own experience of school? Years and years of sitting in a classroom. Mine, I'll be honest, are few. But they are all moments when the teacher broke the mould and surprised me. I'll never forget, for example, the day when my physics teacher at high school brought in a Van de Graaff generator, which is a kind of a big tube with a kind of globe on top of it, and started to teach the class leaning against it with his hand on it like this. Gradually, all the hair on his head was straight up on end. The class obviously was very amused, and at a certain point he just said, "Would you like to know how this happens?" And of course we did. He started the lesson with impact and surprise. Imagine entering the classroom where there's music playing, and on the board there's a picture of a child lost in a forest. The teacher asks everyone in the class to imagine a name and an age for the child. Then the teacher asks students to invent the child's nationality, the house where he or she lives, and then this expands into a personal questions activity with simple questions such as what's her name, how old is she, etc. The class then move around in order to find out what other ideas students had. They do this by asking and answering personal questions. So by starting with an image with music, the lesson breaks the mold of that normal routine and captures the attention of the class. It involves the students in a creative task and then puts language into a meaningful context and is used meaningfully, because children are really asking questions and are really interested in what their classmates have imagined. Here, the use of that magic window of the interactive whiteboard brings infinite possibilities of image, video and sound into the classroom. The interactive whiteboard is really an amazing tool for surprise. The next word is memorability. Something memorable leaves a series of images or emotions inside the person, which, if linked to learning, will anchor concepts and ideas deeply. Why is it that students sometimes learn nothing in class but can immediately memorize an advertising slogan in English, or the lyrics to a song, or simply words learned playing a game online? It's a mix of motivation and memorability. So, the more memorable a presentation or activity is, the more likely our students are to learn it. When I asked an ex-student now in her 20s what she remembered about her first lessons in my classroom, she replied, "The snake." This was a sock with 2 ping pong balls glued to it that I used to practice questions. After 15 years, the playful use of a puppet had remained clearly in her mind. Because it was a game, because there was anticipation of danger and so an emotion, and because it was unexpected and therefore memorable. Learning. Energy. So, how can we bring energy into our classrooms? Well, obviously with movement. It's really important to incorporate movement, physical movement, into the classroom. We can do this through TPR games, total physical response, through body touch games, instruction and movement games, direction games, so that the children get a break from that sitting position which they're in most of the morning. And they can be responding to language or using language and demonstrating their understanding physically. Mind games involve obviously physical movement. This is great for vocabulary revision, a grammar review even, where you could do, for example, present continuouses or imperatives. It's also good for storytelling in the sense that you can get students to interact with the story with movement. Or dialogue reenaction when they're actually standing and physically performing a dialogue. Stretching and physical warm-ups. It'd be nice to start your classes with a kind of ritual workout, particularly if you've got the first hour or the last hour of the day, so that kids just get a moment to stretch their bodies and get a little bit more comfortable. Also to cool down after an intense activity or a physical activity, to get them to just get their bodies back kind of focused and centered. And simply to take a physical break from a long morning of mental work. Having said that, there's also mental energy, and I mean body and mind, meaning that the mind also needs to be moving and thinking and working. And things like a race against time, where the class together must guess a number of words, for example, naming things, creating things, or matching in a time limit words on the electronic whiteboard. Something which makes it exciting, quick thinking, and gets their minds moving with energy. Role plays and theatre scripts obviously put language into action. So you've got verbal and physical communication working together, and that's very stimulating for kids. Creative, inventive pair work or group work means using language to create or invent something. For example, create and design a house with simple furniture, plan a holiday, design a superhero, or create an imaginary friend. Here I've written potato because I've got an activity which is great fun where kids actually have to invent a friend that is physically a potato. A classroom where a student enters with the anticipation of variety, energy, surprise, and with memorable, unpredictable activities will be one that engages the student in a real life experience that promotes an active participation in learning and to school in general. And it will be a living classroom. I'd just like you to think back over the last year of teaching. In what way did your classroom contain variety, surprise, energy, and memorable activities? Now I'd like to approach the specific topic of this first seminar, which is using English in the classroom. Since the 1970s, and through the research and ideas of Krashen about language acquisition, there's been great debate about the pros and cons of always using English, or L2, in the classroom in order to teach English or any foreign language. It's largely recognised that for language learning to be successful, students need to be exposed to L2 input. Research has shown that the amount and the quality of L2 input that students receive has an impact on how fast they acquire the language. And it's also been shown that the teacher's use of L2 affects the learner's learning progress and achievement. Krashen presented the idea of language acquisition as the basis for all language learning. Language acquisition is the informal process of language learning that we all go through to learn our mother tongue. As children, we learn our first language through a vast exposure to language that provides us with a wide variety of contexts and multiple examples to model our understanding and production of the language on. Krashen encouraged the idea of increasing the quantity of L2 used by teachers in the class in order to expose students to a wider variety of language and to model the language in use. So, language acquisition, or Krashen's input hypothesis. Right, what Krashen said was that students learn a new language in a similar way to how they acquired their L1 or mother tongue. So through acquisition, which means through listening to an enormous amount of language and therefore learning it. He also says that students acquire a language only when they understand written or spoken texts which are slightly above their current level of comprehension. That's because they learn new language on a basis of the language they know, listening to language which is slightly above it, and making hypotheses about that language and fitting it into the language they already know. And so what he said was, the teachers should provide students with continual L2 input, so continual listening and reading, in order to give them sufficient contact with L2 to acquire language through the context of meaning. So it's by listening to language that I consolidate the language I know and I learn new language, fitting it in to my idea of the language up to that point. Whereas Long's interaction hypothesis develops on that and says that students can acquire a second language through interaction with a second language speaker, either native or a high-level non-native speaker, which means that it's by using language and using it physically, me speaking English, that I can then interact with another person whose responses will then help me to improve and learn new things and develop my language ability. He also said it was the exposure to natural use of language of a speaker of L2 will both model language in its natural use and present language through meaning and not just form. So I'm understanding the message the person is conveying to me, and therefore language has meaning, and I learn language as something which is meaningful. And that happens when I'm listening to a person who uses that language perfectly. And then we had Swain's output hypothesis, should we say, which is in contrast with Krashen's input hypothesis. What Swain said was that output is as essential as input. Why? Because output requires greater mental effort than input and consequently promotes deeper learning. So, okay, by listening, I can learn language, I can understand meaning, but only when I start to use it myself does it really take deep meaning inside me. And with that mental effort, language becomes more memorable and it becomes something which I use and therefore my property. So, in short, we can summarize by saying that in the process of learning a language, the exposure to language slightly above the level of students' knowledge and the opportunity to experience speaking that language will greatly help learning and will develop real competence. So, should a non-native speaker adopt the use of English only in the classroom? What are the arguments for and against? So, English only in the classroom. Right. Advocates for English only in the classroom would argue that students acquire a second language in the same way as they acquire their first language. By that I mean that they learn language by listening to language. And they also argue that the thought processes for L1 and L2 should be kept separate, because the objective of learning a language is not to become a perfect bilingual speaker. And when you're learning a language, it's useful to keep each single system, separate from others. That way, the language acquires meaning related to its structures and forms, not relating it to another language. And also, they believe, people who are for English only, that language should be presented through meaningful use and not just isolated form and lexis. Again, this means that by presenting language in the target language, it means that not only are we presenting structures, lexis and functional language, but that we're giving it meaning in the moment that we're presenting it, and that everything in the classroom gives meaning to that language. And therefore, we learn that language as a tool for communication and meaning, and not just as a series of structures which we can translate into our own language. However, those against English only in the classroom would argue that language acquisition and the hypothesis of language acquisition are just theories with no evidence of effectiveness. I would contest this and saying that in the last 30 or 40 years of language teaching, with the introduction of communicative language teaching, there has been a distinct improvement in the development of competence, and that students can really understand and speak language and don't just understand it as, should we say, a knowledge which they can then translate from their own language. They would also say that the use of the first language to decode the second language is perfectly natural and time-tested in language learning. Translation gives meaning, they would say. And they would also say that it's unnatural for non-native speakers to abandon their own first language and pretend to be second language speakers, in the sense that by eliminating the first language of a non-native speaker teacher, that we eliminate an enormous resource for learning and communicating meaning to the students. So, what do you feel? Certainly as a mother tongue teacher, it's natural for me to use only English in the classroom. But as a non-native speaker, well, the dilemma is to decide how much L2 to use in the classroom and how much L1, or if to eliminate L1 completely. Certainly, we can all agree that the more English is used in the classroom, both by teacher and students, the more credible English becomes as a real language of communication. And that the more we fill our classroom with English, the greater exposure students will have, and the more they will come into contact with it, not just as a school subject to be learned, memorized and repeated, but as a vehicle for meaning and communication, for play and discovery, a part of students' lives and their experience, and not just another book in the bag. Before embarking on the classroom activities connected to the use of English in the classroom, I'd just like us to reflect on our experience as language learners of English, looking at a couple of questions. So I'd just like you to just reflect for a moment about your own language learning experiences, and particularly about learning English. How did you learn English? Was it in a classroom context? Was it from a self-study book? Did you live in America for a year? How did you learn your English? And as a learner, what were the experiences and environments that facilitated your learning? What worked for you as a student? What kind of a learning environment do you think would promote language learning to children of the primary school in Italy? So, we've talked about a living classroom up to now. What is the classroom or the materials or the approach to teaching that you think would promote most language learning in primary schools? And what changes would you like to make to your classroom this year in order to make it more effective? Before moving on to the practical activities, I'd just like to talk about two of my learning experiences to create two extremes. Obviously, I learned English through acquisition, but I've learned various languages in my life. First, I'd like to talk about my experience of learning Latin, not because Latin is not a fascinating, incredibly important subject, but from my experience of learning it. My teacher was my junior school headmaster called Brian Maybe, a rather serious, severe teacher with his glasses on the end of his nose, a kind of brown jacket. My memories of his classes are of me just daydreaming to the strange sound of him reciting Latin in a very English accent, a bit like a priest reciting a litany. Which actually means the boy annoys the girl. Impossible in my school because there were no girls. However, nothing remains in my memory of Latin, nor any active competence. I would define his classroom as a dead classroom because I had no intrinsic desire to learn Latin. No one did anything to spark off that desire. So I simply did my duty, I got my marks, progressed through to high school qualifications, and happily forgot everything I had learned. The second experience was the one of total acquisition of Italian. I came to Italy in 1989, knowing some French and German, but having no knowledge or experience of Italian as a language. But I was highly attracted to Italy and Italians. So, with a very high level of motivation and desire to learn, the impact with the culture and language was a full immersion that made days seem like eternities. And in a very short time, I was capable of oral comprehension across a wide range of topics and practical situations. And I had a large passive vocabulary and was able to communicate in a kind of ungrammatical version of Italian, but that worked. I guess I was a kind of self-taught level A2. So, my conclusion is that a classroom needs to be a place where language is alive, not dead. And by dead I mean that it is a fixed program of structures and words that need to be learned and memorized and repeat. By alive I mean that the language is a vehicle for real communication in the classroom. Like Italy was for me, an enticing, fascinating, motivating world, very different from my own. So, in a living classroom, there must be physical communication, exchange of ideas. It must be a place where English is the language that can give information about the world, tell stories, lead to creativity. All sorts of things are possible. In short, the classroom must be a place where children experience English. Using English throughout lessons means establishing rituals recognized by the students that they meet frequently and so make a habit of both understanding and using. This aspect of classroom practice very much imitates Krashen, Long and Stein's theories of input, interaction and output. Or put simply, daily contact with familiar uses of English both to understand it and produce it. I'd like now to look at some ways to increase the quantity of language used in the classroom. Some, I imagine, are part of your teaching practice already. Others may be new. Classroom rituals such as good mornings and goodbyes are a simple way of introducing English with meaning. A simple good morning everybody resets the class ready for a lesson in English, not about English. A nice variety to add to this is to teach the class emotions and elicit different types of good morning. For example, happy, Good morning. Tired. Good morning. Worried. Good morning. Scared. Good morning. Angry. Good morning. Surprised. Oh, good morning. So the morning drill becomes an expressive game where the teacher enters and says, "Good morning, happy," and the class respond, interpreting the emotion the teacher commands. The same ritual can be performed with farewells or goodbyes. Goodbye, see you tomorrow. Again, we could add the emotions. So for example, sad, goodbye, see you tomorrow. Or excited, goodbye, see you tomorrow. By further eliciting or connecting a physical prompt for each of these, the class can start and close lessons through verbal and physical expression, emphasizing the use of English as a vehicle for communication and meaning. During one of the lockdown periods, one of my members of staff invented this activity as a 10-minute warmer in order to promote more speaking time in the classroom. It went on to become one of the most important classroom rituals, very popular with the children, and then expanded into a longer activity. It generated a lot of language use and a lot of learning. The name of the activity is Mood of the Day. Simply, in the first week, the teacher introduces this question, "How are you today?" and introduces two possibilities. Are you happy or are you sad? Students choose between the two and make a simple sentence. I'm happy because... Now, what happened here was the open-ended response often meant that students weren't able to complete the sentence in English. So, through their Italian completion, new language was elicited. It was noted on the whiteboard in English so that the next student or in the next lesson that language would be repeated and therefore meaningfully used. So for this first lesson, maybe I'm happy because it's my favorite day. I'm happy because I've got a pizza for my snack. Or I'm happy because I like my new shoes. Whatever was relevant to the student in that day. So as the weeks went by, so week 2, the teacher then introduced, "How are you today?" And they had alternatives between "I'm happy," or "I'm sad," or "I'm angry," or "I'm tired." And so I'm because, so it could be I'm angry because I haven't got a snack, or I'm angry because I argued with my friend. All of this language is produced from a direct need from the children. So that by the end of the year, let's say, or by week 6, the children are able to respond to a variety of emotions: happy, sad, angry, tired, worried, excited, bored, or surprised, using the same formula and learning new language as they go on, expressing their emotions and contributing to the quantity of language spoken in the class. Alongside Mood of the Day, another activity that could generate a daily use of English would be a question factory. A question factory can just be a box or a jar, or it'd be nice to have like a cutout factory created on a box that contains questions. As the syllabus progresses, more questions get put into the question factory so that the opening of the lesson, or whenever you choose to do the activity, could be simply based around all the questions inside the question factory. At the start of the year, for example, you might like to have, "What's the weather like today?" Or, "How are you today?" linking into Mood of the Day. Or, what's your favourite question? Simply like, what's your favourite sport? What's your favourite snack? Or, have you got questions such as, have you got a pet? Have you got a computer? Or, what time questions like, what time do you start school? Etc. As the year goes by, more questions will go in so that you've got questions like, how old are you? Do you like? Questions, where do you live? Can you? Are you? And everything that comes up on the syllabus as a question. So all of these questions are now in the classroom, inside the factory, and can be pulled out in a random order. This leads immediately to a series of activities and games. It could lead to a team game, for example, whereby the teacher pulls out a question randomly and asks it to one member of the class. If that class member responds correctly, the team, the class, win the question. If that student can't ask, maybe the teacher can give the class a second chance, but if nobody can respond, then that goes to the teacher. After the game, obviously, the questions that the students couldn't answer can be pulled out again and reinforced and taught again. There's obviously many ways to play this game. It could be two class groups, or it could be a total that the class get, a bit like our wall chart, no, for evaluating students. And that way, every week we could see if there's progress in the class. It could just be simply a lesson warm-up where quick questions are pulled out and asked to the class. It could be something to do with pair work, so that the questions are distributed in the class, or a little role play or question sheet, whereby the students stand up, move around and ask and answer questions. Or it could be in the form of a class quiz. One interesting way of doing this is to give the response to the question and see if the student can give you the question. That's a way of stimulating memory to actually produce the questions themselves. Or, maybe in a younger class, these questions could be asked by a puppet or as I called it, a classroom snake. The snake appears behind the student and asks questions in a very snaky voice. And this becomes a little role play with the children answering the questions, feeling rather worried about what the snake might do. So, how can we get our students to make requests frequently and generate a multiple number of requests? We could do it by turning this into a game. The game we could call Ridiculous Requests. We could use this as a warmer in order to revise requests at the beginning of any class, or on a frequent basis, or at the end of a class when you've got 5 minutes. The teacher first asks students requests. If the request is reasonable, the student replies, yes, of course. If not, no, of course not. So here are some examples of some ridiculous requests. For example, you could say to the class, can you dance with me? And or to one student, the student could say, no, of course not. Or, yes, of course, at which point the student stands up and dances with the teacher. Or you may, in winter, for example, say, oh, can I open the window? And the student could say, of course not. Or another student who's hot-blooded could say, yes, of course. Can you give me 50 euros? Can I paint your face? Can you sing me a song? Can I take your glasses? Can you mime a monkey? Can I sleep on your desk? Can you kiss my feet? Can I eat your snack? Can you fly with me? All of these, in this way, would become opportunities for fun, for humour. Of course, the teacher's got to be willing to do whatever the student says if they say, yes, of course. This activity can then be turned around so it's the student, one student in the class making a request to the other students. When we talked about setting up the classroom with a circle of chairs and one person in the centre, this is a perfect type of game that we could use. Another useful way of encouraging the class to use English is to use some kind of a wall chart where you can track the progress and development of the class, and how much English they actually use. This could be something like this, where you've got English users, class 3B. So on the left, you've got the different lessons of this month. In the center, you write for each lesson the names of the students that actually used English. Here we've got Jasmine, Andrea, Elisa, Lara, Khalid, okay? These are the students that used English in the class. The class gets stars for the number of students that use English. So, in that lesson with 5 students using English, we could give the class 5 stars. Obviously, if 10 students use it, or 15 students, then we could keep the maximum to 5. Very much like the kind of ratings on TripAdvisor or sites like this. But it would mean that the class knows that at the beginning of every lesson, they're motivated to speak English in order to get their 5 stars. And at the end of the month, looking, shall we say, at the progress of the class in that sense, the teacher could give them a certificate or some kind of reward saying that they have been promoted to a very good English user class, or an excellent English user class, or at the end of the year, an expert English user class. You could use the same system as bronze, silver, platinum, no, like for records or CDs. But it's a way of motivating students to use English in requests, in language in the classroom, in speaking activities. And I find it very effective. Another important area of keeping English alive in the classroom is the use of classroom commands. In the first lesson with new groups, I find it really useful to teach the class a series of basic instructions through total physical response, TPR. Simple instructions such as stand up, sit down, jump up, jump left, jump right, turn round, stand on one leg, touch your nose, your shoulder, your hand, step left, step right, step forward, step back, look up, look down, left, right, put up your hand or put down your hand, open or close your book, or open or close your eyes as well, take out or put away your pen or your book. Finally, and put on or take off your jacket or your hat or whatever it is. These basic instructions can be taught with a simple gesture or mimed action, or obviously the real action such as stand up and sit down. And so that the students grasp language and the meaning of language by making a physical action. And once the students know all of these commands, we can then begin to gradually add others as the year goes by. So we can have rather more comical or interesting actions such as duck, wink, dance, rub your tummy or rub your nose, close or open your eyes, blow a kiss, stand still, melt, freeze, scream, or hide. Or stuff like get under your chair, get under your desk, get on, okay. Once you've got all of these commands going, it means that you can play at any point of the day, the beginning of a lesson, the end of a lesson, an activity with commands. There are various games you can play with these as well. Simply giving commands as a teacher and the students copying, or the same activity but in pairs. Or a really nice variant on this is to play robot, where one student is the controller of the robot and the other student is the robot, but must do the actions in a robotic way. Another good game obviously is Simon Says. So every time you say Simon says stand up, the class stand up. If you just give the command but don't say Simon says, like stand up, in that case the students that stand up are eliminated from the game. Another nice version of this, which is nothing particularly different than giving the commands, but has a special element, is called Captain's Coming. Use all the commands that the class knows, but tell them that you are their captain. And therefore you give the commands in a military way. But you add one special command, which is Captain's Coming. When you say Captain's Coming, all the class must stand absolutely still and salute. And you as a teacher move around the class, observing each student to see they don't move. This gives that theatrical element which really brings the game alive. So what other classroom rituals can we create in order to guarantee that our children have frequent, meaningful contact with English? Well, I'd like to think about some classroom events, or should we say repeated events, that in the classroom children will come across either annually or once a month or during the year. For example, festivals. Obviously, a festival is a seasonal return of repeated language, activities, and in this students can reinforce the language and build new knowledge and competence. Traditionally, this has been possible with festivals such as Christmas. It can include Christmas vocabulary, carols, Christmas cards, Christmas traditions, Christmas stories, Christmas videos, or maybe even a small Christmas performance. Obviously, today, celebrating Christmas is not always appropriate in the context of the multicultural classroom. So perhaps we have to think about another type of festival, and we could invent a festival such as an English Day, which maybe all the classes in the school celebrate every year. And on this day, children can expect to play games, do quizzes, sing songs or listen to stories. And it would become a moment of the year where children know that they're going to be using the language they know and meeting familiar language too, to enjoy a day of celebration of this language. Another area which repeats much more often is birthdays. Clearly, in a class of 20, 25 children, you're going to have at least 15 or 16 birthdays a year. So, building around that, a classroom ritual where either we count the number of years the child has, or sing happy birthday simply, or maybe talk about presents or whatever. That ritual will bring English to life because it's real English and it's related to somebody's real life. Another area is tests. It's a great temptation to introduce a test in Italian and then give a test about English. In that case, we haven't communicated that our classroom is a living classroom where English is used for all communication. If we were to use English to introduce using simple instructions such as everybody sit down, put away your books, take out a pen, do you understand, are you ready, or you've got 30 minutes, all of this language, when used frequently, will become part and parcel of the students' knowledge and competence. And if you think about it, it's preparing them for what will very likely be their future, because nearly all students nowadays, either in middle school or in high school or even at the end of primary school, will be taking English language examinations where the examiners speak only in English. So we're actually preparing them for a real life experience. Finally, many teachers today work in different subjects, not just in English. So there's an opportunity to present cross-curricular use of English. I think this is an incredibly important and valid area, so that a teacher who's presenting maths could use English for a lesson or in every lesson in order to relate English to real life experiences of students, such as calculation, addition, and using language in other areas of their instruction. So we don't just learn English, we learn things in English. Just to recap then, the kind of activities we could be talking about. We could have rituals that involve songs, traditions, greetings cards, instructions, games, food, objects, quizzes, stories, and even performances. All of these events will bring English into the classroom. Finally, what I call green screen travellers and classroom guests. Over the last year, with the pandemic restrictions, I've been working on a project called English Connection, together with teachers of the primary school. The project's objective was to bring the outside world into the classroom through an online teacher. As such, I and the teachers, designed a project with a travelling character whose name is Tom Timble. Tom presents each lesson from a different part of the world. Here's Tom, as you can see. Using a green screen, I could travel literally around the world to many different places, to Canada, South Africa, India, Australia, London. So each lesson started with a series of questions about that place. Whilst each lesson involved the vocabulary and functions on the school programme, the success of the project was very much that weekly meeting with Tom and the children's expectations and curiosity to know where Tom would go. The questions that repeated every week became spontaneous and familiar, and consequently the whole event became like a ritual on a weekly basis. Another kind of visitor to the classroom could be a parent who's a mother tongue speaker, or another mother tongue speaker who appears on the board, or comes to the classroom themselves to talk about something or do something with the children. External figures obviously change the whole atmosphere of the classroom. I personally work as a theatre workshop teacher and have worked with many classes over the years in primary school, presenting theatre projects only speaking in English, with a text an original text written in English, working with the children for about 8 classes to create a final performance. These have been extraordinary experiences where the curiosity, the desire to play, the natural enjoyment of expression that children have has really brought the classroom and their English to life. I will never forget a student, she was 9 years old, who came up to me after a performance. She was a very demotivated student. She had very little self-esteem, was convinced she couldn't learn English. At the end of the project, she came up to me and she said 3 things. She said, "I didn't think I could do it. I really enjoyed doing it. When can I do it again?" The living classroom, or the place where language was alive and a means of real communication, had created in that child a new sense of interest, of belief, and a desire to study in the future. So I believe very strongly that projects like this will bring your classroom to life. So we've come to the end of this first seminar, but I'd like to finish by asking you some questions to think about. The first question is this: how can I immediately, from the start of the year, increase the amount of English spoken in my classroom? The second is, what can I do in every lesson to expose students to familiar language and encourage them to produce it? The third is, what events and projects and visitors can I plan to surprise my students and bring my English language classroom to life? The fourth is, what classroom rituals can I implement to get students into the habit of using English in every class that I teach? So, thank you very much for your attention and your time. I do hope you've found this seminar stimulating or interesting, and hope that you will move on to the second, which is called Vocabulary as a Springboard to Communication. I'll leave you just by saying, remember, there's no such thing as teaching. There's only learning.